The entire string trailed that one stray home and changed 2 lives. The ball of twine was the size of a man's head, and it had been sitting in the same corner of the tack room for 11 years. I know because I put it there. End of September 1882, I'd spun the last of it off a spool my father left me and wound it into that ball in the hour after his funeral, and I'd never touched it since. Not because it meant anything in particular. Just that I hadn't needed it, and something about the shape of it on the floor, round and dense and going nowhere, felt true enough to leave alone. I think about that twine ball now and then, the way things sit still for years, and then suddenly they don't. There was a length of string that got loose in October of '89. I didn't know it at the time. I was 3 miles north on the Cutter lease, which is what folks around Harlan County called my place on account of my last name being Cutter, though the land wasn't mine and never had been. I worked fence line for the Alderman Ranch, had for going on 16 years. Elias Alderman was a fair man, not warm but fair, and he paid me on time and let me keep a line shack on the north quarter with a small wood stove and a cot and a place to hang my coat, and for a long stretch of years that was enough. It was enough, or I told myself it was. After a while the difference between the two closes up and you stop examining it. I was mending wire that day. October cold had come early, frost still on the grass at mid-morning, my breath hanging in the air in front of my face. My gloves had a hole in the left index finger and the wire kept catching that finger, and every time it did I'd look at the hole and think I should have gotten new gloves in town and then put it out of my mind and go back to the wire. That's the kind of man I am, not the kind who goes to town for gloves, the kind who works through the hole. I had 2 horses, one for working and one for the times I needed to be somewhere in a hurry, which wasn't often. That morning I had the working horse, a big gray mare named Gable, not after anyone, just after the shape of her nose, and she was tied to a fence post 20 feet back, pulling at the frost-burnt grass and not finding much. There was a sound she made when she was annoyed, a kind of short, forceful exhale that was almost a word, and she'd been making it every few minutes all morning. I'd found the break in the wire before sunup. Cattle had pushed through sometime in the night, likely chasing the smell of water from the creek on the other side. 4 of them. I'd counted the tracks, gotten them back in before anyone from the main house came looking, which suited me. I didn't like explaining things. Not because I'd done wrong, just because explaining things to Alderman meant standing in a room with him and talking, and I'd never been built for that. So I was mending wire. Cold morning, sore finger, irritated horse. And I didn't know that 3 miles south of me, on the road into Halford, a woman's saddlebag had come open. I didn't meet Nora Vane that day. I need you to understand that before I go further, because the way people tell a story they always make the first connection the meeting, and that wasn't how it went. The first connection was the string. She'd been riding into Halford from the Clarendon station, where the rail let her off with 2 trunks and a saddlebag, and a horse she'd bought from a man at the station for what I later learned was too much money. The clasp on the saddlebag, one of those pressed metal things that looks solid and isn't, had worked itself loose sometime in the first mile, and the bag had drifted open by degrees over the next 2 miles, and various small things had been dropping out of it for most of that ride without her noticing. She'd had her hat pulled down against the wind and was watching the road ahead and thinking. She told me later about where she'd put her books. The things that dropped out: a folded letter, a small tin of salve, a button that had come off a coat, 1 glove, just one, and a ball of twine. The letter got caught in a stand of buffalo grass and stayed there. The tin rolled to the shoulder. The button disappeared entirely. The glove I'd learn about later. The twine, her ball of twine, rolled out of the bag, hit the road, and then, with the particular stubbornness of a round thing on an imperfect surface, didn't stop. It went to the edge of the road and then off it into the shallow ditch, and then the end of it caught on something, a weed, a root. I never saw exactly what, and the ball kept rolling, but the end stayed caught, and so the twine paid out behind it as it went, unspooling through the brown grass of the ditch and into the field beyond. It went a long way. It went, from what I figured later, almost 200 yards, which means it was a substantial ball to begin with. It crossed into Alderman's east pasture, which is where I found it 2 days later. I was walking that pasture checking for more fence breaks when I saw the string. Just a thin line of it, pale against the dead grass, going straight as a drawn line from somewhere near the road and ending 50 feet ahead of me in a compressed, mostly unspooled tangle near a fence post. I picked it up, walked the line back to the road, found where it had caught on a root, and beyond that in the ditch, the remnants of what the ball had been. Not much left. A core of the thing the size of a hen's egg. I stood there in the road with that piece of twine in my hands for a minute. Cold morning, early. No one coming in either direction, and I thought, somebody lost this. That seems like an obvious thought. But what I mean is I stood there with it and felt, in a way I couldn't have explained then, that somebody had passed through this exact spot in some distress. Not the distress of crisis, but the smaller distress of losing things and not knowing it, and that it seemed like a wrong thing to let lie. I put the remnant in my coat pocket and walked back to where the string had snagged, and I began winding it. The whole 200 yards of it, back onto the remnant core, kneeling in the dead grass and turning it in my hands. It took a while. The string was dirty and one section had gotten wet and dried stiff, but I wound it all back. I don't know why I did that. I'm not a sentimental man, but it seemed like the right use of a half hour. I'd been to Halford twice that month before I went in with the twine. Once for feed, once because Alderman sent me with a message for the land office. Third time I tied Gable out front of the general store and went inside and asked Chester Pruitt, who ran the place, if anyone had come through recently having lost things off a saddlebag on the East Road. Chester had a way of looking at you like you'd asked him something indecent. He did that now. Lost things, he said. Off a saddlebag, couple days back, twine, maybe a glove. New school teacher, Chester said then, and his expression changed. Come in 2 days after she arrived asking after a saddlebag clasp. Lost near everything in it, she said. Letter from her sister, and her spare gloves and some other things. She find her things. Letter turned up, somebody brought in a tin of something, gloves no. He looked at the wound ball in my hand. That hers. Might be where she's staying. Hargrove boarding house, other end of the street, but she'll be at the schoolhouse this hour. He paused. New, came from Clarendon, name's Vane. I thanked him and went back out into the cold. The schoolhouse was a single-room building at the north end of Halford's Main Street, with a bell on the roof that had a broken clapper and so served no purpose, though nobody'd taken it down. There were 8 horses tied out front, and the sound of children's voices inside, and I stood there for a moment thinking, this was possibly a strange thing to be doing, walking up to a schoolhouse with a ball of twine. But I'd gone to the trouble of winding it. I knocked. The voices went quiet. A pause, and then the door opened, and a woman stood there, looking at me the way people do when they're interrupting something, and they know it and they're deciding quickly how much patience they have. She was maybe 40, dark hair going gray at one temple on the right side, cut close to her head. She had a pen in one hand, uncapped. She was wearing a wool dress, brown, practical, and she'd rolled the left sleeve to the elbow, which suggested she'd been writing on the board and had gotten chalk on it, which she had. Her face was not beautiful in the way people say women should be beautiful. It was sharper than that. She had the kind of face that looked like it had thought hard and recently. Yes, she said. I held out the ball of twine. Chester Pruitt said you lost some things off your saddlebag, coming in from the station. She looked at the twine, then at me, then at the twine again. That was days ago, she said. Yes, ma'am. I found it in Alderman's east pasture. Took me a while to wind it back. It had gone out into the field a ways. I paused. I didn't know whose it was when I found it. Had to ask in town. She took it from my hand, turned it over. The ball was smaller than it had been, obviously. A third of what it started as, maybe, but tightly wound the way I'd done it, it had some weight to it still. "The rest is gone," I said. 200 yards or so out across the field, I wound back what I could find. She looked up at me then, not the quick appraising look she'd had before, a different one, a look that stayed. "You walked 200 yards of string back in," she said. "Kneeling mostly, the grass was flat enough." "Why would you do that?" I thought about it. Seemed like someone had lost something without knowing it, I said. Seemed like a thing that ought to be returned. She held the remnant of the ball against her palm. 8 children behind her were very quiet, which told me they were listening hard. "My name is Nora Vane," she said. "I'm the new school teacher." "Silas Cutter. I work fence line for aldermen." "Thank you, Mr. Cutter," she said. And she meant it. Not in the polite way people say things to be done with a conversation. She said it the way a person says something they've been wanting to say and weren't sure they'd get the chance. I put my hat back on and went back to Gable and rode north. That was October. November came and I didn't go into Halford for 3 weeks, and when I did I didn't see her, and I told myself that was fine because there was nothing to see her about. December I went in twice for supplies, and once because 2 of Alderman's hands were in a disagreement that had turned physical at the saloon, and Alderman sent me to settle it, which I did by standing in the room and not leaving until both men felt the weight of the situation. That's a skill I have. I don't have many, but I have that one. I saw her the second trip in December. She was coming out of the general store with a crate of books, moving too fast for the crate, and I was coming up the steps as she came down, and what happened was that the crate tilted and I caught the low end of it before the books went out into the mud. We stood there for a moment, both holding the crate. "Mr. Cutter," she said. "Mrs. Vane." "It's Miss," she said. "The Mrs. was a long time ago and didn't take." "Miss Vane." "Thank you again," she said. "You seem to make a habit of this." "Of what?" "Of catching things before they fall." I didn't have an answer to that. We carried the crate to her wagon together, and she told me she was heading back to the boarding house, that she had 40 pages of arithmetic to correct before morning, that the children were progressing faster than she'd expected, and she was running short on primers and had ordered more from Clarendon. She said all of this quickly, in the way people talk when they're used to talking to themselves. Then she stopped. "Do you read, Mr. Cutter?" "Some." "What do you read?" "Whatever comes through." I thought about it. "Got a book on water geology I've read twice." Elias Alderman had a set of Dickens that he let me borrow. "Which one was your favorite?" "David Copperfield," I said without having to think. She nodded like that confirmed something she'd been considering. "I'll bring you something next time you're in town," she said, "as a trade." "For what?" "For the twine and the books." She got up on the wagon. "Most men in this county wouldn't have returned the twine, Mr. Cutter. They'd have used it or thrown it away." I watched her drive up the street. I didn't know what to do with that. So I did what I usually did with things I didn't know what to do with. I went back to the work and let it sit in the back of my mind until it either meant something or it didn't. She brought me a book in January. She must have asked Chester or someone where I'd be, because she rode out to the north fence line on a Thursday morning when the temperature was barely above 0, and found me resetting a corner post that had heaved with the frost. She tied her horse and came through the fence and walked along the line until she reached me, and she was carrying a book wrapped in cloth. "Trollope," she said, holding it out. "He's not Dickens, but he's honest." I took it. It was a Barchester novel, the first of them, worn at the spine, her name written in pencil on the inside front cover. Nora Vane. The N of Nora was large and decisive. "You rode out here in this cold," I said. "I had business south of the line anyway," she said, which I didn't believe. We stood there in the wind for a minute. I had the post half set. She looked at the work, the hole, the post, the tamping bar leaning against the wire, with the specific attention of someone who understands physical work even if she doesn't do it. "How long have you worked this land?" she said. 16 years. "Do you own any of it?" "No." "Would you want to?" Nobody had ever asked me that. I thought about the shack on the north quarter with the wood stove that smoked when the wind was from the east, and the cot, and the coat hook. I thought about the twine ball in the corner that I'd moved to the shelf when I cleared the floor last spring. "There's a piece of ground about 1.5 miles east that's never been claimed," I said. "Creek access, decent grass." "I've looked at it." "How long have you been looking at it?" 7 years, give or take. She was quiet. She wasn't judging me for that. I could feel the difference. She was just taking it in. "That's a long time to look at a piece of ground," she said. "I know it. What's kept you from filing?" I set the tamping bar into the hole and worked it a few strokes before answering. "When you've been a hand your whole life," I said, "owning a thing seems like it's meant for somebody else." She didn't say anything to that right away. The wind came up and she pulled her coat tighter with one hand and put the other hand in her pocket. "I grew up thinking the same thing," she said finally, "about everything." I looked at her. She was watching the horses. "Didn't stop you from coming out here alone," I said. "No," she said, "it didn't." A pause. "It took a long time, though." She said goodbye and mounted and rode south. And I watched until she was a small shape against the gray sky, and then I went back to the post and tamped it until it was solid. That night I read the first 40 pages of the trollope by the stove, her name on the inside, the N large and decisive. February was bad. One of those stretches where the cold comes down like a hand and doesn't lift for 3 weeks. I didn't go to town, and I didn't expect to hear from anyone, and I didn't. There was enough work to fill the days, a windmill to repair, a section of wire that kept going slack, 2 heifers that needed tending after a rough calving, and at night I read the trollope and then started over from the beginning when I finished it. In the last week of February, in the gap between one storm and the next, I rode south to check the lower pasture and found a horse standing at the fence line with its reins dragging. I knew the horse. It was hers. She was half a mile back, sitting in the snow against a fence post, not unconscious. She looked up when she heard Gable's hooves, and I saw that she was holding her right wrist against her chest. "Horse spooked," she said, "through me." I got up and started walking, and then decided against it. I got down and crouched in front of her. "How long have you been sitting here?" "Not long, maybe half an hour." The temperature was somewhere below 20. She was pale but steady, her jaw set, her eyes clear. "I'm going to look at your wrist," I said. "It's not broken. I've broken bones before, it's sprained." "I'm going to look at it anyway." She let me take her arm. Her wrist was swollen, already darkening. I moved it carefully in 2 directions and she didn't make a sound, though the set of her jaw went harder. Not broken. She was right. "Can you ride?" I said. "I can ride." "Then we're going to my line shack. It's closer than town." She didn't argue. I got her horse and helped her mount. She gripped the saddle horn with her left hand and didn't complain about the right, and we rode north. The shack was warm. I had a fire going inside 20 minutes and she sat in the one chair I owned, which was a ladder back with a cracked rung, and I wrapped her wrist in a strip of cloth, and she watched me do it without commentary. "You know how to do that," she said when I finished. "Done it a few times, mostly on myself." "A hazardous occupation." "Fencing?" I said. "Yes." She looked around the shack then. The stove, the cot, the shelf with the 2 books, the trollope and the water geology book, and on the lower shelf the ball of twine. My father's ball. "Is that my twine?" she said. "No, that's mine." She looked at it, then at me. "I keep it," I said, "from my father's things." "And you found mine in the field." Yes. She was quiet, looking at the shelf. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind was picking up again, the next storm building its front. I'll need to stay the night, she said, not asking, just stating the situation. Yes, I said, I'll take the floor. You don't need to do that. I do, I said, and I will. She looked at me then with that look she had, the one that stayed. You are a very particular kind of man, Silas Cutter, she said. I've been told I'm strange. That's not what I said. She looked at her wrapped wrist. I said particular, there's a difference. She slept in the cot. I slept on the floor, which was fine. I'd slept on worse. In the morning the storm had come and she couldn't ride out, and so she stayed a second night, and a third. By the third morning her wrist was better and the storm had broken, and we talked more than I'd talked to anyone in years. She talked about Clarendon, where she'd come from, about her marriage, which had ended not in death, but in an agreement that they were not what each other needed, and that it was better to be honest about it. She talked about her sister in Ohio, and the letter that had blown out of her saddlebag, which had eventually found her by way of a family in Halford who'd picked it up off the road. She talked about the children in her class, the ones who were quick and the ones who needed more time, and she spoke about both with equal attention. She asked me about the land east of Alderman's. I told her more than I'd meant to about it. The slope of it, the way the creek ran in spring, the grass that came in thick on the south-facing side of the low ridge that ran through it. You love that land, she said. I haven't touched it. That doesn't mean you don't love it. I was quiet for a while. The stove was going low and I got up and fed it. My mother used to say that a man who doesn't have a place of his own is a man waiting to become himself, I said. Smart woman. She died when I was 11. I only remember that one thing she used to say. Nora was quiet. Then, I think you became yourself some time ago, Mr. Cutter. The land is just the thing that comes next. Nobody had said anything like that to me. Not in 54 years of life had anyone said anything like that to me. I didn't know what to do with it, so I looked at the stove door until my face settled. You should file on that land, she said, this spring. I've been thinking on it. Think faster, she said, and then she almost smiled. She rode out on the fourth morning. We didn't make a production of the goodbye. She took her horse and I helped her mount, and she thanked me for the fire and the hospitality, and I said I was glad to be of help, and she rode south. But at the turn in the fence line she stopped and looked back at me, and she said something that I almost didn't hear, the wind being what it was. She said, I'd like to come back. I said, the door's not locked. She rode on. March. She came out twice to the fence line, the second time bringing food in a covered pan that she balanced on the pommel of her saddle the whole way. Lamb stew, she said. Made it herself. I ate it standing because I didn't have a proper table in the shack, just a board across two sawhorses, and she sat in the ladder-back chair and watched me eat and talked about a student named Emmett who'd worked out a multiplication problem on the board so fast that she'd checked it twice to make sure she hadn't made an error. He's going to need more than I can give him soon, she said. Send him somewhere with a real school. There's a college in Clarendon if his family could manage it. She paused. I'm writing a letter for him. I handed her back the empty pan. She took it, and our hands were close on the handle for a moment, and neither of us moved. Then she said, Silas. First time she'd used my name without the mister. Have you filed on that land yet? Not yet, I said. Will you? I'm going to the land office next week. She nodded. She set the pan down and looked at her hands. If you file on it, she said, and you build something there, even something small, that's a different life than the one you've been living. I know it. I want you to know I'd like to be part of that life, she said. I'm saying that plainly because I think you're a man who does better with plain. She looked up at me then. If that's not what you want, I'll understand it and we won't mention it again, but I think it is what you want. and I think you've been waiting a long time to want anything at all." I was 54 years old. I had worked another man's fence line for 16 years. I owned 2 horses and a bedroll and a broken chair and a ball of twine. I had been told in various ways by various people over the years that I was odd, that I was quiet, that I was not the kind of man who made a woman feel particular or wanted, that I was suited to solitary work because I had no real need for anyone. Nora Vane was looking at me from across a board on 2 sawhorses with a clean pan in her hands, and she was saying plainly that she wanted to be part of my life. I set my hand flat on the board between us and didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "I'm going to file on Monday. You want to come with me to the land office?" She looked at my hand on the board, and then she set hers next to it, her fingers touching the edge of mine. "Yes," she said, "I do." The land office was a Thursday thing, not Monday. Turned out the clerk only kept regular hours on Thursdays, and I'd had the days wrong. Nora thought that was funny. She had a laugh that was sudden and quiet, like something had caught her off guard even when it hadn't. We rode in together on a Thursday in the last week of March. Elia's alderman saw us from the door of the feed store as we passed, and gave me a look that I couldn't fully read, not disapproving, just surprised, in the way men are surprised when they realize something was happening near them that they didn't notice. The clerk at the land office was a thin man named Foss who had more paper on his desk than seemed possible. He looked at me, and then at Nora, and then at me again. I told him I was filing a claim on the eastern parcel, Section 14. Told him the acreage I'd been measuring in my head for 7 years. He looked it up in his ledger. "That ground's been open since '76, he said. "I know. You Cutter, Alderman's man." "I work for Alderman. I'm my own man." Foss looked at me again. Then he pushed the forms across the desk. I signed where I was told to sign. Nora stood at my left, not saying anything, not needing to. When I put the pen down, Foss blotted the forms and recorded the claim in the ledger, and said the land was mine to the extent of the claim as filed, subject to the Acts of 1872, and I nodded like I understood all of that, which I mostly did. Outside on the board sidewalk, Nora put her hand through my arm. She just did it, matter of fact, like it was already a thing we did. Her hand in my arm on the main street of Halford in the last week of March with people passing. I have carried a lot of weight in my life. Wire and posts and frozen feed sacks and heifers that didn't want to move. I have carried cold and solitude, and the understanding that most people don't particularly see you unless you're in their way. Her hand through my arm was lighter than any of it, and I felt it down to the bottom of my boots. "What do you want to build first?" she said. "House," I said. "Small, good stove." "Good stove is critical," she said. "I know it." We walked up the street to Chester Pruitt's store and went in out of the wind, and Chester looked at us and then looked at the ceiling and said what could he help us with. And I bought 3 pounds of coffee and a new pair of gloves, left hand only, because I still had one good glove from the old pair. And Nora bought 2 tins of something and a length of ribbon for one of her students. And we went back out into the March cold with our things, and it was an ordinary purchase on an ordinary day, and it was also not that at all. Summer came. I broke ground on the east parcel in May, with the help of 2 of Alderman's younger hands who I paid in labor, traded back to them when they needed it. Elia's alderman said nothing about the claim, but he let me take a week off the fence line in June to frame the walls, and his wife sent over a pot of something one evening, which was the warmest thing she'd done in 16 years of my knowing them. The house was small, 1 room for the time being, with a sleeping loft and a kitchen corner and a good stove. I bought the stove first, before the framing, and left it sitting in the field covered with canvas while I built the structure around it. Nora said that was exactly the kind of decision she would have expected from me, and she said it without irony, and I understood that it was a compliment. She helped where she could. On Saturdays she'd ride out and I'd set her to doing things that didn't require brute strength, sanding boards, cutting rope to length, mixing mortar for the foundation stones. She was good at physical work, focused and not wasteful of motion, and she didn't talk when there was nothing to say and talked freely when there was. That balance is rarer than most people know. One afternoon in July, she was up on the frame cutting roofing material while I was setting the last corner boards below, and I looked up from the work and she was sitting on the frame with her feet dangling, and the valley spread out east of us in the summer light, gold and brown and green in patches. The creek, a thin silver line to the north. "Silas," she said. "What? This is a good piece of ground." "I know it. 7 years you looked at it." 7 years. She looked at the valley and then at me. "Worth it," she said. There is a thing that happens to a man when someone who is not obligated to think well of him does so anyway. It's not the same as being loved by family, because family is compelled by blood and history and the machinery of being people who share a name. It's not the same as being respected by an employer because that's a transaction. What it is a woman who has seen you in your actual size, not larger, not smaller, and who decides with full information that she would like to be where you are. Nora Vane had seen me in my actual size. She'd seen the shack and the broken chair and the 2 horses and the 16 years of other men's fence line and the 7 years of looking at a piece of ground without filing. She'd seen me standing in the cold not knowing what to do with a compliment. She'd seen the old ball of twine on the shelf and understood what it meant without being told. And she'd put her hand through my arm on the main street of Halford, matter of fact. I'd spent a long time as the kind of man that didn't happen to. The kind of man who was useful without being particularly wanted, who was dependable in the way that a fence post is dependable, solid, necessary, not something you give much thought to unless it fails. I had not known that a person could look at you and see the thing you were instead of the things you weren't. I had not known what it did to a man to be seen that way. I know now. We married in September, the 2nd year. Small. Chester Prewitt as a witness because he'd been present for most of it in one way or another, and the preacher from the Halford church who married people quickly and without unnecessary language, which I appreciated. Nora wore gray, not white. She said white was for beginnings, and she wasn't at the beginning of anything. She was in the middle, which was better. I thought that was the truest thing I'd ever heard about marriage. I wore my good shirt, which was the only one without a patch. Afterward we went to the house on the east parcel, which had a roof now and a finished floor and a stove that drew clean in any wind. I had built a table, a proper one, and 2 chairs. The ladder-back chair from the shack I'd brought over and put in the corner where it belonged, cracked rung and all. Some things you keep. On the shelf above the stove, I put the 2 balls of twine side by side. Mine dense and dark with handling, the size of a man's head. Hers smaller now, what was left of what had rolled across Alderman's east pasture in October of '89, wound back tight. Nora looked at them a long time when she first saw them there. "You put them together," she said. "Seemed right." She reached up and touched the smaller one, her fingers on the wound string. "That was the beginning," she said, "that ball of twine rolling out of the bag." "It was. All that distance it traveled," she turned to look at me, "all that way it came to land where you could find it." I looked at her, her dark hair in the lamplight, the gray at her right temple, the pen callus on the inside of her middle finger, the way she held herself, straight-backed and unhurried. "It got you home," she said softly, "that string. One stray piece of it, and here we are." I didn't have a fine answer for that. I'm not a man with fine answers. What I did was reach out and take her hand in both of mine, and she turned toward me and put her other hand on my chest over my heart, and we stood that way in the lamplight of our own house with the 2 balls of twine on the shelf above the stove, and the creek making its quiet sound somewhere to the north. My land, my house, my stove that drew clean. Her hand on my chest. Outside, the first cool air of a new fall was settling into the valley, and the grass on the south-facing ridge was still gold, and it would be a while before anything needed fixing. I had done enough things right, finally, to deserve something like this. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.